New details are coming to light about the OceanGate submersible. According to Current Affairs, past interviews contain quotes of late OceanGate CEO Stockton Rush ignoring concerns from others about the Titan submersible. In 2018, OceanGate's Director of Marine Operations produced a document warning of the, quote, potential dangers to passengers of the Titan as the submersible reached extreme depths. And a few months after, others in the industry sent Rush a letter telling him that his experimental approach could lead to catastrophic problems, Current Affairs reports. In interviews, he reportedly showed levels of self-confidence, and some of his statements allegedly include the following. I have broken some rules to make this. The carbon fiber and titanium, there is a rule that you don't do that. Well, I did. At some point, safety just is pure waste. I think I can do this just as safely by breaking the rules. The sub-industry is obscenely safe because they have all these regulations, but it also hasn't innovated or grown because they have all these regulations.
Innovative approach flies in the face of the submersible orthodoxy, but that is the nature of innovation. We have heard the baseless cries of "you are going to kill someone" way too often, and I take this as a serious personal insult. In an interview, Rush allegedly also said, I think it was General MacArthur who said, "You're remembered for the rules you break."
Yeah, and I think we actually have a clip of that video of him making that statement right here.
I'd like to be remembered as an innovator. I think it was General MacArthur said, "You're remembered for the rules you break." And, you know, I've broken some rules to make this. I think I've broken them with logic and good engineering behind me. The carbon fiber and titanium, there's a rule you don't do that. Well, I did.
Now, specifically on that point, scientists have said that having that mixture of materials in the hull was a red flag for anybody with any engineering background because of the nature of the contraction and expansion under pressure of the hull going to great depths, that you're going to have micro fractures accumulating over time, that the integrity of the ship is not going to rebound fully, and that over time, eventually, this sort of tragedy was inevitable. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, it's not that he just sent other people to this fate. He was one of the participants. So he lived this philosophy of, you know, being combative with whatever protocols you're supposed to follow. And that was absolutely the wrong thing to do in this case. And it sounds like people, even within his own company, were concerned about what he was doing. I have some, I guess, sympathy for the idea that always following the rules is not necessarily good, and just because there's a rule for how you're supposed to do it doesn't necessarily mean that is necessarily right. What are the interests of the entity or individual or regulator or company that forced you to do that rule, and is it totally necessary? You know, that's just like from an abstract point of view, but clearly it was, in this case, something they should have done differently.
OceanGate's Director of Marine Operations, his name was Mr. Lockridge, I suppose. In court documents, he urged the company to get the vessel certified, but said that he had been told that OceanGate was unwilling to pay for such an assessment. Now, that doesn't sound to me so much like I want to innovate. It sounds like maybe I have some recognition that the regulations, the certification might be beneficial, but I am interested in cutting corners for financial reasons. And it's also worth noting that it's been reported that there are about 10 vessels in the world that are designed to go to these kinds of depths. All of them are certified except for the one that ended up imploding at the bottom of the ocean floor near the Titanic. So, I mean, it's hard to escape that this does feel somewhat like a parable about the competing values here of kind of deregulatory camps versus the benefits of regulation. That's not to say every regulation is made equally, and it's not to say that there aren't times laws and rules that impose, the kinds of restrictions that can be limiting and are, in fact, unnecessary. But I do think that this is a significant warning that there are oftentimes scientific basis, safety rationale for having certain kinds of regulations, especially when you have an individual like Mr. Rush, who is not just implicating his own life in these kinds of scientific exploratory events, but is leading innocents who don't have the same information that he does about the integrity of this vessel and are perhaps following his example and thinking, well, if he's going to go down, it must be safe, when obviously that wasn't the case.
Sure. I mean, he didn't force them like at gunpoint to get in this submersible. This is something they wanted to do. This is something they paid an exorbitant amount of money to do. I mean, they should have anticipated that it is an inherently risky thing to do, and taken that into account. I've heard conflicting reports on, especially the young man passenger, the passenger who was the son of one of the other passengers who obviously died.
Yeah.
I've now heard conflicting reports. I've heard it reported that he didn't want to do it, and then more recently I've heard that his mother was supposed to be on it, but he wanted to do it so much that she gave up her place to him.
Yeah, he wanted to set a record for the deepest solving of a Rubik's Cube, something like that.
That's what I saw.
Which is, you know, some people were critical of the mother for having made that admission, like it was an indictment of her own kind of parenting choices or something to allow her child to do that, or to admit that it should have been her. I mean, that's something that she's gonna, I'm sure, live with and wrestle with for the rest of her life, the playing out the counterfactuals. Not that it was her fault that the ship was designed so dangerously and it was such a risky endeavor. But again, I mean, the fundamental issue here is I think there are real there's psychological evidence of the human being's inability to properly assess their own risk. And there are some real issues from a legal perspective of having the law designed so that if you assume, you can say that you assumed risk without really having full knowledge of the risk that you've assumed. And Stockton Rush was in the position to actually know what the risks were in this experiment, and I think misrepresented the safety here. I mean, this is a letter from OceanGate's marketing team. Said the marketing of the Titan had been at minimum misleading because it claimed that the submersible would meet or exceed the safety standards of a risk assessment company known as D&V, even though the company had no plans to have the craft formally certified by the agency. Like, at a certain point, you are actively lying about the safety standards that your vessel has or can meet. And despite all of the, I think, schadenfreude around rich people paying to go to the bottom of the ocean and whether that was an advisable choice, they too were misled and potentially criminally misled in this. Yeah,
I'm sure, and I'm sure there's going to be litigation fallout from this that may be perfectly appropriate given what he has said about the policies he didn't want to follow. I wanted to end with, this is almost relevant to the conversation we were having about Trump and the documents and Milley. He quoted Douglas MacArthur, about you're only remembered for the rules you break. MacArthur obviously was the head of U.S. forces for a long time and in the Korean War, and then was agitating to continue the Korean War at a time where the Truman administration wanted to wind it down. He was trying to, he went rogue to try to inspire public support for it. He was having conversations with other governments about continuing it, and so he got fired. Truman fired him, and this quote I love from Truman, who later said, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bee," although he was, but that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail. Example of the generals going against what the president's desire for peace was and being fired for it. Speaks to what we're talking about with the Trump-Milley Iran thing.
All right. Well, look, I'd love to hear you guys weigh in. Does this make you reflect at all on the value of these kind of regulatory efforts? Does this change anything about how you've been interpreting what happened in this submersible tragedy? Stick around. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.